You're writing a story, maybe a novel, maybe a screenplay, maybe a short story, maybe a D&D campaign or a video game. Whatever it is you're writing, you want a rich story world that feels lived in and authentic and that your audiences want to know more about. These kinds of worlds that we see in our favorite TV shows and movies that we read about in our favorite books. And I want to talk to you about one of the ways to develop your world to have that richness that makes it feel authentic and lived in. And I'm going to frame this with the term little histories. Little histories. Now, what do I mean by a little history? A little history is a story within a story. We've got our big story, and a little history is a story that is a historical story, being in our fictional world, it's true. And it's little, it's inconsequential, it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. And a little history might be how someone came about an object or how someone personally came about to where they are. And I'm going to divide this up into two things. First will be objects, and the second will be people. Now, little histories for objects. On my desk, I have several pens. This pen I got several years ago at from a vendor at a convention, and it has a particular backstory. The actual backstory of this pen doesn't matter. But imagine writing a character who is doing some work, sitting at a desk, writing something down, and the other character standing around goes, "That's a really cool pen. I haven't seen that before. Where'd you get that?" And they say, "Well, this is glad you asked. This was my grandfather's. This was a special pen that was made by hand. This was this old thing. I don't know. I think maybe I got this at the dentist last time I was there. There was just I was signing something and put it in my pocket and walked away without thinking about it." What that little history, whatever it is you write about that little history for that object, gives that object some permanence in the world. That object didn't just appear in that scene for that. The little history of that object might not be relevant at all. It might not really be necessary for the plot for you to draw attention to the pen or that object on the desk or the new shoes the character is wearing or the spiffy shirt they have on. That might not drive the plot in any way, but it does add permanence to that object in that world. And in that sense, it gives that world some richness and some histories that are ongoing. One of my favorite examples of this that sticks in my mind, I used to listen to all of the, obviously, digital recordings after the fact. I'm not quite that old. The recordings of the radio dramas of the old radio show Dragnet. And they have these little slice of life tidbits in there that make it really easy to imagine living in this era 80 years ago from our modern day. And one of these was the two detectives are walking along, and you hear the footsteps. You know, the Foley editors put in the footsteps, and they're walking along on the sidewalks in Los Angeles, and it starts raining. And one of the detectives pulls out of his pocket a plastic raincoat. And this is a new technology at the time, and there's a conversation about where'd you get this plastic raincoat? It looks so silly. It's so thin. I can see right through it. That's not going to stop any water. Clearly, he's not familiar with this is a new technology at the time, so he's amazed at this plastic raincoat. The story had nothing to do with the rain or the raincoat. It was just a plastic raincoat a little disposable poncho the guy had with him. But it made that feel so real to interrupt this dramatic police procedural where they're hunting down a murderer or they're finding a bank robber, for the guy to go, "What is that thing you're wearing? I can see right through it. How's that going to do anything to stop the water?" That's a little history. That object that he brought in, the character explained how his friend told him about it and he bought it at this department store. Now there's the friend in the department store and this jacket that's been riding around in his pocket and his worries, his concerns about being out in the rain and damaging his wool or his camel hair coat. That added so much richness to that story, to have that little inclusion that wasn't part of the plot. And that is an important way to keep it as an enriching agent and not a crutch. I will add a caveat here that little histories and drawing attention to small objects can very easily slip into jargon, and we want to avoid jargon, right? So the example, if you're writing a story and it's a science fiction story, and there's two spaceships and one is trying to outrun another, and the captain says down to the engineering, like, give the flux capacitor 1.21 gigawatts so our hyperdrive can whatever, and they say we need more dilithium crystals, and you're going, as a reader, as a viewer, as someone who's experiencing that story, you're going, this is kind of just hand wavy so that they can move this plot along. These objects, these elements that they're talking about here, aren't really there for the purpose of enriching the world. They're there for moving the plot. Those are fine. We'll talk about those some other time. I just want to talk about stories that are there to enrich the plot. And you can have both. So imagine a story world where your characters are trapped in some building and they come across a locked door, and one of them goes, well, I just happen to be, and let's jump into our second category here of people. One of them just happens to be a former locksmith. Well, isn't that convenient? That timing couldn't have been better to reveal to the audience. They're confronted with the locked door, and now we're revealing that one of the characters used to be a locksmith. That's jargony, that's hand wavy, that's just to drive the plot forward. That's not really enriching the story world. That's not for the purpose of enriching the story world. Now, it's a great element to have a previous career. That's a fantastic little history to include in your story world. In a story like a regular old Star Trek episode, all of the characters that you'll see didn't have previous jobs, at least for the most part. We can think about a Captain Picard as sort of always a Captain Picard. And you don't go like, well, what did you do before this? Were you a cobbler? Were you a candlestick maker? Like, what did you do? Now, that might be an element that you intentionally include in your story. For example, the fantastic novel series and TV series Silo, Wool, Dust, Shift, those stories have a social structure where the characters within that social structure are given jobs, sort of, they don't have the same flexibility to move from one job to another. They are dictated what they do. So if you work in mechanical, or you work in administrative, or you work in IT, or whatever department you work in, you're there in that department, and you don't really fill out an application and hire into a new job. That was intentional, and the lack of little histories, the fact that none of those characters, with a few exceptions, the fact that the few exceptions prove the rule, was foregrounded in those stories to say this character moved from mechanical to administrative. That's a big jump. That's a major shift in that storytelling, and that tells us something about this world, that the characters don't have the ability to move from one place to another. And that might be a really important thing for you to use to define your story world. The lack of little histories. The little history of, what did a person do before this? Where did you live before this? Well, if you live in a silo in the ground, that's an inconsequential question. It doesn't even make sense. They've always lived in there. But if your story world exists in a place where people can migrate from one nation to another, from one state to another, from one planet to another, from one galaxy to another, it might be fantastically interesting to give some context. Don't just think about the characters as what they do now. Even simple characters, even characters that aren't your main characters, that are driving the plot, that are the antagonist, that have the most rich development and growth. Little characters can have little histories that really enrich the world. Imagine walking into the DMV to pay your registration fees annually. What a boring little thing, just part of the world. And the person behind the counter goes, that's a fantastic necklace you have. You know, I used to be a jeweler when I lived in New York, and I really like, whoever made that is a fantastic craftsman. There's nothing about that exchange that's driving the plot forward. But now in your story world, the characters that exist have some permanence, and have existed in that world for a long time and have done things beyond the scope of this little administrative building where they're filling out paperwork. They had other lives. They have other hobbies. They do other things. So those little histories of where people came from, what they used to do, how they got here, those skills and knowledge that they've brought with them can be really an excellent way to add that richness and lived in feeling and authenticity to your story world. Now, I said they can be both jargony, driving the plot forward, and for the purpose of enriching things. Be careful if you're going to use one of these little histories as as an element that moves your plot forward, to introduce it in a way that distinguishes the richness it adds and the plot part. Audiences will understand them as two separate things. So, for example, for the example we had earlier where our characters came across a locked door and one of them reveals conveniently at that moment that they used to be a locksmith, well, that's just driving the plot forward. If that were revealed hundreds of pages earlier, where they're sitting around in their dormitory, maybe now they're an expeditionary space marine and they're going out to hunt bugs, and they're sitting in their bunk and everyone's reading a book or playing a guitar, they're just passing time, and this one person is sitting over there picking a lock. What are you doing with a lock? Where'd you get a pet? What are you doing with that? Oh, it's a hobby of mine. It's called lock sport. I used to be a locksmith. I used to work in a hardware store, and they'd bring in the keys and I'd have to rechange them. I love these kind of things. It's mechanical. It's like a little puzzle. That gives some richness to the character, and that little history of what that person did before adds some permanence to that world, some lived-in authenticity to that story world, and can be foreshadowing that you can use that if that character needs to draw on those talents later on, 100 pages farther down the story in the book, then your audience, your readership is prepared to accept that that isn't just a very convenient ex machina that allows your plot to move forward. So it can be both. That richness that you add to your story world can be used to drive the plot as well, but I would caution against making it too on the nose for when you reveal it. So be thoughtful as to how you implement these things. I would love to hear examples that you guys have come up with or other ideas about how to add richness, or your favorite examples in fiction, in movies, in books, where some object has had a little history that was interesting to you, that added maybe an unexpected feeling of authenticity and lived in story world for you. So please share those with us, add them in the comments, because the more we fill out this conversation, the more we have this conversation, the better all of our writing is going to be. Thank you guys very much.